Every so often I find myself being interrupted by thoughts of death. For instance, I'll be driving along an ordinary road on an ordinary day and I'll see a long line of cars driving down the road and they're following a hearse, and I can't help but think of death. Who did it take this time? Who did it steal away from loved ones this time? What happened? And then of course you think of cemeteries. And of course you never really want to think of cemeteries unless you really have to. And cemeteries they mark the end of things, don't they? They mark the end of long-lasting relationships, long-lasting hopes, dreams, plans. You know, in almost every town you'll find monuments, right? You'll find monuments to fallen war heroes or industrial accomplishments, or you'll find a monument to a local hero who achieved a global accomplishment. Cemeteries seem to just be monuments of one thing: death. That's why they usually tuck cemeteries away on an edge of town somewhere, or in some place where they're hard to find, because who really wants to be reminded of that? Well, after Jesus died by crucifixion, he ended up in a cemetery too. And when he died, so did the hopes of so many people who followed him. Jesus had hundreds, if not thousands, of followers who looked at Jesus and saw the hope of a new beginning. And so many thought maybe this would be our time, and maybe in my generation we would see God do something new and bring victory and hope and triumph and peace. That's why when Jesus walked into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, he did so to a throng of cheers and hosannas. But it was to be short-lived, because behind the scenes, the powers that be were scheming against Jesus, plotting and planning to get rid of Jesus. All of his enemies were against him, and even one of his own turned against him, Judas Iscariot, who planned and schemed and eventually turned Jesus over to his enemies. And so after one last meal and one last prayer, Jesus was handed over to a crowd of thugs and soldiers who brandished torches and swords. They brought Jesus to the high priest, and all night Jesus was interrogated ruthlessly, brutally, mocked, spit on. He was falsely accused of being a blasphemer. After that, and the Jews were finished with him, they handed him over to the Romans, who had mastered the art of crucifixion. But before they crucified Jesus, they beat Jesus with clubs. They spit on him, they mocked him, they whipped him and flogged him. And after the Romans had tortured him, they told Jesus that he had to carry his own cross to Golgotha. But by then he was much too weak. So a man named Simon of Cyrene was one of the bystanders in Jerusalem when the streets were full of people because of Passover. And they told Simon that he must carry Jesus' cross. And he did so to the place of the skull, which is what we call Golgotha. And that is where things got really gruesome. They would have laid Jesus down on the ground. Two soldiers would have pinned Jesus' arm to the crossbeam of the cross, while one drove a 6-inch spike into one arm, and probably at the same time, two other soldiers were doing that on the other side, while one person drove a 6-inch spike into Jesus' other arm. They then would have hoisted him up, and so the crossbeam of the cross would have sat on the vertical beam of the cross, and then they would have driven the last spike into both of his ankles into the vertical beam. It wasn't long after that Jesus died. And right before he did, he said these final words: "It is finished." Now, it was custom for the Roman soldiers, if there were still victims of crucifixion alive, they would go and they would break the legs of the people on the crucifixes. They would do this to speed up their death and thus make the Roman soldiers' days shorter, but Jesus was dead by then, and so they pierced his side and blood and water fell out. In many cases, the bodies of those on the crucifixes would stay on the crosses for days, opening themselves up to this scavenging birds, insects, elements, rodents. But this was not the case for Jesus, because there were two men, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, who asked Pilate if they could take Jesus' body. So they took Jesus' body, they took it off the cross, they put burial clothes around it, and then they went to a cemetery where Joseph of Arimathea had his own tomb. And they placed Jesus in that tomb. By that time, everybody had scattered from the scene, and so too did the hopes and the dreams of all of these people that put their trust in Jesus. Well, they scattered too. Jesus was 33 years old when he died. And you know, usually in times when someone was executed, especially in their day, there was plenty of good reasons for it. If you were involved in any sort of revolutionary activity, or if there was a hint of a rumor that you were against Rome, you could be executed. If you were a person who stole a loaf of bread, you could be executed. If you were a person who talked poorly to a Roman official or a soldier, you could be executed. But Jesus did no such thing. Jesus' record was spotless. And that is why for so many people, this death was so disturbing, so confusing. It was senseless. In fact, of all the deaths that have ever been carried out, this was probably the most senseless. Which begs the question, why? And then you wonder, maybe there was something bigger going on. And so you ask, what if? What if this wasn't just man's plan to kill Jesus, but what if this was part of God's plan? And what if Jesus was in on this? And what if all the pain of this world, all the dying, all the killing, all the murder, all the hurt, all the pain, what if all of it could be solved? What if there could be an end to all of it? And what if Jesus knew that he was part of that hope and that plan? What if Jesus willingly went to the Roman cross because he knew it was the only way to truly save us and to give us a life worth living? Now, suppose we could ponder this more, and perhaps maybe we will in a couple days when we celebrate Easter. But one thing we should probably ponder, even if it is for a couple days, is why? Why would Jesus do something like that? Give himself to be such a great and amazing sacrifice for us? What would motivate a person to do something so great? Love. Jesus died on the cross because he did not want death to define us. He died on the cross because he wants love to define us. Greater love has no one than this. Then he laid down his life for his friends. May we all, in these days before Easter and every day after, ponder the incredible, immeasurable, powerful love of God.